because Venezuela's happened. But now Iran, this is a long-term strategic game plan by the Trump administration to systematically dismantle certain key elements of China, right? Russia's bogged down in Ukraine. Let the Europeans handle that. Trump has always been obsessed with this strategic competition between the Chinese and the Americans.
Is similar to the Cold War, and you cannot help but look at those conflicts like Iran or whether regime change in Venezuela as sort of proxy wars in a broader game where you cannot ignore external elements like China. Obviously, Iran, a few years ago, there was this notion of the axis of appeal is a term that was used by some American political scientists and analysts to describe the emergent alliance of the kind of anti-democratic.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome to The Global Gambit, a program that looks at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economics. And well, we tend to do things mainly online, but as you could see, I'm in person, and I am in person with Professor Sergey Radchenko, who's the distinguished Professor Wilson E. Smith, Professor of SAIS Europe Bologna, which is quite the title, and it's delightful to be speaking with you in person, coming from SAIS and the building where I actually did graduate a few years ago, so I'm in a low. There's quite a lot happening right now in the world with the war in Iran and the escalations right there, the continued tensions and just elongation of the war in Ukraine. And I think what we wanted to do in this two-part chat was have a deep dive. You've done a lot of work on the Cold War, on history, on Russia, China, great power competition, and I think there's a lot of lessons and things that we can take away from those, right, to understand. I think the first thing I sort of really wanted to learn in this part one, where we look at sort of the war in Iran and this relationship to what you study and cover, is when we look at what America first got interested in Iran in the 1950s and 53. What does that tell us about what's happening right now?
Right. Well, Pyotr, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. Great to do it. Regarding America's interests in the Middle East and Iran, I think if you go back to the 50s, obviously what's happening now, right? What's happening now has echoes in history. I think if you speak to any Iranians, they will remember 1953. They will remember that moment historically when the Americans were accessory to the overthrow of a legitimate leader in Iran, Mossadegh. It was a special operation. And if you ask, why did the Americans do that, going back to 53, why did they effectively install the Shah, whom they worked with very happily for many decades? The answer seems to be that it was about the fears of Soviet influence back then in the early 1950s. Very different from the British, because of course Mossadegh, the British back in the 50s, was all about oil. Mossadegh was the one who was pushing for the more nationalization of British oil interests. For the Americans, it was less of an issue, but they feared that Mossadegh would sell out to the Soviets. They're thinking about Iran much as about the rest of the region. It was really impacted by the Cold War mentality. They feared the Soviets would somehow get into the spoil. And we know, of course, that earlier, 53, that Stalin was already dead at that point. He died in March 53. But before that, in 46, the Iranian crisis was like the first real big crisis of the Cold War. At that time, Stalin was trying to get to the Iranian oil interests and was trying to occupy a part of northern Iran, then ultimately withdrew in 1946. This was a major crisis. And the Americans feared that Soviet influence. They feared the Soviets would get to control Iranian oil, and what's more important, deny it to the West. And so they moved in 1953 to overthrow a legitimate leader, Mossadegh. Then they basically strengthened the Shah. And then from the nights, well, especially since the Nixon administration, Nixon really developed a close relationship with the Shah, and that was a very, very good Cold War relationship between Cold War Iran and the United States that continued very happily until 78, 79, until the Iranian Revolution, when obviously the Shah was overthrown, had to flee, and then you have the hostage crisis. Still, even at that moment, at that point in time, Iran was something like a proxy. It was like a theater where Cold War struggles were being fought out. Because you think about the Iranian Revolution, for example, the Soviets also had their ideas about Iran at that time, and they thought, okay, the Shah is overthrown, maybe we will be able to get in there. They in fact reached out to the founder of the Islamic regime, Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and they thought that they could actually deal with Khomeini and everything would turn out fine. And Khomeini, from the start, was very anti-American, but he was willing to deal with the Soviets for a little while until the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, which happened in December 1979. And that relationship also kind of collapsed, the Soviet-Iranian relationship. All of which is to say that Iran has been at the center of great power struggle and great power confrontation. I could say from the beginning of the Cold War, but I'm a Cold War historian. I always love to sell the Cold War, but it was actually during the Great Game, even this century before, 19th century, the British, Russia, actually the Great Game. It's all about Iran, Persia at that time. It would, this is where imperial interests collided. So how is it, how does it connect to where we are today? In some ways it connects because you still have other powers, like for example, China, Russia, who are interested in the fate of Iran. You have the United States that is going there for who knows what particular purpose at the moment, nobody can tell. So there are echoes of the past. Iran is still seen as perhaps a theater for great powers to sort out their interests, although I would say that it's also a little bit different because the United States does not face peer competitors now in that area, right? The Russians have their relationship with Iran, but it's not at the same level of threat to American interests as, for example, historically the Soviet Union had been, or like the Russian Empire had been to the British interests in Persia. The Chinese, they're the great power, but what are they doing to help their friends in Iran? Not much, actually.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I wanted to touch on or bring up the British-Russian imperialist Great Game because that's immediately where my head goes. But the Afghan war, the Soviets' war in Afghanistan is obviously something that people, I think, forget coincides in terms of the beginning with the Iranian Revolution. And, to again try and draw parallels where we can, or to a degree, I get the feeling the Trump administration's approach to this could be like the Soviets' Afghanistan, not America's Afghanistan, because that's more about nation building. It's a bit different. But I think this could be an absolute quagmire and catastrophe. Maybe more in the air, but now they're thinking about arming the Kurds.
Yeah.
Obviously, things are changing, so we're trying to keep it more historical, to keep it timely, but
that is so true. In fact, that parallel just sort of jumped into my mind when I heard about the beginning of American, special operation, or what do call it now? Strange parallels to Russia's invasion. Operation Epic Fury.
I think Putin needs to call his own operation something like
They
this.
should do better in
Glorious Kremlin.
to sell it better. But here's the interest. I mean, you're right about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right? So the Soviets invade for I won't say anything. There was a reason that at that time the ruler of Afghanistan, Hafizullah Amin, was someone whom the Soviets did not trust. He was allegedly pro-Soviet. They felt that he would sell out and become like potentially an American friend in the region. So I think they feared that aspect. But in the end, and I think they invaded and they thought, okay, we'll get rid of the guy, then we'll put on the army. First, they went in and killed the guy, right? They killed him in, and then they moved the army in. And they realized very quickly it was a quagmire. And it seemed that at that point, it became a question of, well, you want to win this war because it's important for the credibility of a superpower. Why? The Soviet Union is going to be defeated by this, people in Afghanistan. That's outrageous. How can you do that? So the difference with the United States is that now we're in the how many days of this war against Iraq. It's like nobody knows what it's all war. Like nobody can give the reason. Okay, what's the purpose of this?
5 days of what the Soviets was like decade.
Well, for the Soviets, it was decades because they realized quickly, by the way, that was a bad idea. But then they got into this position of credibility, right? So you get in, and it's a superpower issue, and maybe that's something that is going to help Trump because he doesn't seem to have concerns about credibility. Like he doesn't care. Maybe he will fight a war against Iran for a few weeks and then say, this was a victory. Let's go home. And this is the best thing that can happen actually, because if he starts to think in terms like the Soviets thought about Afghanistan, it's an issue of credibility, or the Americans thought about Vietnam, that it's an issue of credibility, he has to bring it to a conclusion. What is a conclusion in Iran? Something that, somehow would serve American interests. No one knows what American interests are in the moment in this situation. So I see the American current bombardment of Iran to have even less of a strategic rationale than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Because in this case of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as crazy as it was, but at least there was a process. They said, okay, we don't like this guy for the particular reason that he may sell out to the United States. In the case of Iran, we have this unclear reference. There was what's her name, the White House spokesperson.
Oh, right.
Who was talking about it just the other day, and she said, the president had a hunch, he had a feeling, he had a feeling that this is going to threaten American interests. What does it mean? Nobody knows what it means. But this is the new reality of American foreign policy. It's
Sick, he actually had an itch at the back of his neck, and he was like, "That's irritating. Why not irritated Alice going around by us?"
I mean, that does sound almost comical, right? And for Trump, it doesn't. Well, it doesn't. This is the kind of stuff that he does. But if you look historically, you had like American, the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. There was a strategic rationale there. They feared that there would be Soviet influence coming into Iran, that Mossadegh would sell out to the Soviets. By the way, this was completely wrong because the Soviets thought that Mossadegh was unreliable and etc. They were not going to get into that. There was no real chance.
Interesting. So it was a miscalculation.
It was not miscalculation. It was a misperception. So they got it wrong about Mossadegh. Right? We now know from the Soviet side of the story that the Soviets did not trust Mossadegh. So, but at least there was a rationale. We are going to overthrow this guy. Which was not a military operation, it was a special operation, right? It was the...
Yeah, right, you're right, clandestine to the fact.
But at least there's a rationale. When the Americans tried to rescue hostages that were taken by the Khomeini regime,
Yes.
During the hostage crisis, well, and obviously that was a huge disaster of the Carter administration in 1979. Well, that also had some kind of rationale. Okay, you go in, you're trying to rescue hostages, right? You've got a reason to be there to do something. Now it's you read their justifications and you're like, okay, well, that doesn't really make sense. So that is the great mystery about Trump's the White House foreign policy at the moment.
But just to build on that, though, because I think a lot of people will be wondering how much, or those who know their history will probably be aware that the Soviet Union's invasion to Afghanistan was part of the implosion of the Soviet Union, right? Aside from the internal economics and that the Soviet Union wasn't able to keep up with America's just economic, and let alone Glasnost and Perestroika under Gorbachev. But like, how much is this going to be an implosion of the American economy? Or is America just so much more that connect to be stronger and unified in that way that it's not going to have the same?
Right. I mean, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was problematic, obviously, for the Soviet Union. I won't say that the quagmire actually costs all that much for them. Certainly did not cost as much as, for example, the American, decades of war in Afghanistan, or indeed the American involvement in Vietnam. And that, I think there a colleague of mine, Evgeny Kalinovsky, wrote a wonderful book about the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan called The Long Goodbye, in which he actually managed to calculate how much that was, what percentage of the Soviet military budget the Soviet operation actually was, and it wasn't such a great percentage. So in other words, it could be sustained in financial reasons, but where it really hit at the Soviet legitimacy was once you have glasnost in the USSR, and you have to explain to your people, like, what are we doing in Afghanistan? Like, what's the purpose of going there and killing these poor people? There's no sense in all of that, right? So that really undermined Gorbachev in many ways, although he actually facilitated with the Soviet withdrawal. And of course, after he came to power, so took him how many years from 85 to February 89 to actually fully effect the Soviet withdrawal. So Afghanistan was a part of the story of the Soviet collapse, but not the most significant part. In terms of America's wars in the Middle East, and here Iran is just part of the much bigger story, right? You can go back to the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. You can probably frame in different terms, but Iraq, the whole mess that unfolded there, in my view, contributed significantly to the dismantlement or the isolation. The falling apart of the world order, the American legislative order, disintegration of the world order. It started in Iraq in many ways because it was a bad idea. I think in retrospect, a much worse idea than even it seemed at the time. We just saw what the 20th anniversary a couple of years ago, and there was a book by Leffler about this, in which he says, well, these people actually believed, the Bush administration believed what they were saying about Iraq and how it represented a danger to American interests, et cetera, et cetera. And I hear that, but it's still, in retrospect, it seems like such a terrible decision to go there and waste all that power, waste all that American credibility on the region, create also a gigantic mess, which we're still trying to
ISIS, isn't it?
yeah, ISIS, all of that. So if you take that, right, the backdrop of American misadventure in the Middle East, those 20 years bombing Iran, it's like, okay, it's bad, but it's not like previous administrations did much better, right?
No.
The whole thing was like a disaster from going back to 2002.
But this is why Iran's so big, because it's much bigger than Iraq. It makes the war in Iraq because there's people contemplating boots on the ground.
Well, yeah,
aerial campaign is one thing, but we know from history that no aerial campaign has ever successfully ensured regime change.
one example, Serbia, of course, with Milosevic. Well, that's one example. That's a very interesting example. But you're exactly right. But here's where I think there's reason to be hopeful. Again, you go back to the American experience in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the Americans in Iraq from 2003 onwards, the whole situation. And you see that what really created this long, protracted wars was the issue of credibility. So you get committed there and you cannot get out. To me, Trump comes across as a guy who doesn't have a strategy, but also doesn't worry about credibility. Like, this is a guy that doesn't have a problem with credibility. So he could, in other words, what I'm saying is he could lose the war. He could bomb the hell out of Iran, and sometime later he'll just say, "Okay, we've achieved a great victory. We're going back home." And of course, nothing will change. The Iranians will, still remain hostile. Vile regime will continue in its existence, and probably get worse and still pursue their weapons programs, etc. Amid, albeit with the degraded capabilities. But it's not like Trump has to fight for 20 years in Iran in order to prove that America is a credible superpower. I think you can basically proclaim victory tomorrow and say, okay, we're done. We have won, even though he has not won, right? It's just what he did with the Operation Midnight Hammer. Remember that a few months ago with the strikes on Iran? And at that time he said, well, we've wiped out the Iranian nuclear obliterate. It will never obliterate. It will never come back. And now he's like, okay, we have to, obliterate it again just a few months later, right?
Sounds adult. Yeah, no, but it's interesting you say about that. I guess I use the phrase optics a lot in my commentary on analysis videos, which people should definitely go and check out, right, if you're listening or watching on the channel. But that aside, right, I think I call it optics, right? The optics of the international arena. I guess credibility is the same thing, but in this regard, we're seeing, I think, an effective walk back. To put it into contemporary events momentarily, I think we are seeing an attempted walk back by the United States government, because this nebulous idea of regime change. I mean, how far do you go down the system before you're like, yes, we've adequately eradicated it, right? We've got so many clerics, we've got the assembly of experts, we've got all these elements, the IRGC, which is 150,000, the besiege, which is another 100,000+, let alone the Artet, which is the military, the conventional military. When you think about that, and it's all well and easy to start war, but how do you finish it? Or the day after tomorrow, these sorts of things. When you look back at the Cold War, what comes to your mind about that? We've talked about Afghanistan. Is it like sort of the case of Vietnam? Because they want to arm a guerrilla group in the form of the Kurds, and that's what makes the deal of Afghanistan, Vietnam.
Yeah. So again, in those cases, like Vietnam, for example, right? You go in, you feel like this is necessary. You mean to do it for just a short period of time, then you get sucked into the quagmire. And the reason you stay there, you get sucked into it, and you stay there, is because you worry about your credibility. In other words, if you get out, and then the communists take over, which ultimately, of course, is what happened, then your credibility will be undermined, because they'll say, oh, the United States cannot even defeat Vietnam. What kind of superpower is that? And the other issue is that there is actually strategic rationale there, in the sense of, okay, you go to Vietnam to oppose communists, because there is a fear of a knock-on effect of the communist triumph in Vietnam, that they could potentially spread across, the Southeast Asia, the domino theory, as we know it, which was, obviously something that Eisenhower first put forward. And that is what really kept the United States bogged down there for such a long time. And the same thing goes to the Soviet Union, to, any number of those quagmire proxy wars. What we have today is, to my mind, as a historian, I think we have to see those differences, right? We can go back to Vietnam, we can go back to Afghanistan during the Cold War. We can see that those things happened in the context of a Cold War, where a loss, a defeat in one part of the world could trigger a crisis for the United States, allegedly, because that's how we're thinking. In other parts of the world, American credibility being undermined, etc. The Soviet credibility being undermined in Afghanistan. Today, can you frame that, the American actions in those terms? Or is there something else? I don't think it's the same thing. In other words, Iran seems to be, in a way, kind of peripheral, really, to, I mean, Vietnam also was peripheral, Afghanistan was peripheral. But I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like it being defeated in Iran somehow will fundamentally alter the picture for the United States globally. And it's not that the United States is going to be defeated, but I'm saying it's not, you don't have to commit to this war for years and years and years for no reason, right?
But it's interesting you say that, maybe not for the duration factor, but one quite high level theory that I've seen floating about is that because Venezuela's happened, because somehow they're tying in the cartels as well, but now Iran, this is a long-term strategic game plan by the Trump administration to systematically dismantle certain key elements of China, right? Russia's bogged down in Ukraine, let the Europeans handle that. Trump has always been obsessed with this strategic competition between the Chinese and the Americans, whatever, Beijing and Washington. Is there any truth to that? But Iran is a tool, a pawn within a broad
proxy war. And I guess, that's again, I highlighted the contrast between the Cold War and the present, but increasingly there's an argument among some analysts who say that our present predicament in some ways is similar to the Cold War, and you cannot help but look at those conflicts like Iran, or whether, regime change in Venezuela, as sort of proxy wars in a broader game where you cannot ignore external elements like China. Now, what do we make of this? I mean, obviously, Iran, a few years ago, there was this notion of the axis of upheaval. Have you heard about this? The term the axis of upheaval?
There's axis of resistance, but that was in the Middle East. So the context of God was the
Yeah, the axis of upheaval is a term that was used by some American political scientists and analysts to describe the emergent alliance of the kind of anti-democratic rivals, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, which to me is actually quite funny because first of all, those countries don't really have, I mean, in neighbors like that, like the North Koreans and the Chinese hate each other. The Russians and the Chinese, of course, they work together, but there are serious issues there. Iran is a theocracy, so how do you bunch it together? The funniest thing is, of course, the axis of upheaval. I mean, the greatest factor of upheaval in the United States is in the world today is the United States, right? People will being the leading power in the axis of upheaval. But anyway, but still there was this argument that those powers, Iran and China, together, and indeed there were some interesting aspects of cooperation. Now, you don't actually have Iran as a part of some kind of a defense alliance involving China, for example. Or involving Russia. Now, Russia and North Korea, if you look at different parts of this so-called axis, which I don't think exists, but if you look at different parts of it, you can see that Russia and North Korea, they have a treaty, an actual defense treaty, right? So there's a mutual obligation defense clause. The Chinese and the Russians don't have that. They have any number of just general proclamations, so well-wish, etc., but they operate very closely in various areas, but they don't have a defense alliance between them. China and Iran don't have that. Russia and Iran have a treaty of own comprehensive strategic partnership that went into effect last October. A lot of people actually mistakenly claimed that this was a military alliance between Russia and Iran, which is not the case, despite the fact that Iran has been or had been helping Russia with in the war against Ukraine. But the Chinese and Iranians, I think, are in some ways the weakest link here in terms of, political terms. Yeah, I don't think there's all that much between Beijing and Tehran, frankly. Their economic interests, they're very important, and that's why China has been very upset. I mean, China has made a number of proclamations since the beginning of American, the Epic Fury thing. They've made all kinds of proclamations saying this is against the international law. This is, American hegemony trying to spread itself through this region, et cetera, et cetera. And there are political reasons for that opposition. There are also economic reasons. I mean, while Russia is China's main source of crude oil, Iran has been a source of crude oil as well. So Iran and China have this close economic relationship, and obviously the closing of the Strait of Hormuz cannot help but present challenges to China, for which much of its energy supply actually came from the Middle East. So the Chinese are concerned. And obviously, if you have a regime a regime being toppled, or Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, it's something that the Chinese cannot, but I guess, see as affecting them, because today it's Ali Khamenei, tomorrow might be Xi Jinping, right? So they have to make this connection. So they are worried about it. They're worried about it. Now, what is Trump? What is the Trump administration thinking with regard to China, with regard to that relationship? I simply don't know. From what we see so far, there wasn't real much strategic thinking going into this. Now, whether in reality, maybe 30 years later, we'll find out that some, national security National Security Council, classified documents will tell us as part of the story that actually this was a way to undermine China's influence. We may find out, but given what we know about the Trump administration, I think I'd just go with chaos.
Chaos theory.
Chaos theory is chaos theory is the best working theory, but it's not to say the Chinese are happy with this. Obviously, the Chinese are not happy, and if we're completely frank, both the removal of Maduro in Venezuela and the attack on and the death of Ali Khamenei can be seen as kind of setbacks for China. In other words, right? Those people are people with whom China have reasonable relation, and therefore they see that as bad, and they would see that as defeat for themselves and an advancement of American power, American interests. Maybe, I guess that's how they would interpret it in Beijing.
Yeah, I made an analysis of that myself recently, and I think it comes back to the system, right? Like,
the Chinese are a one-party system, a one-party nation, and like any autocratic system. Also, just to clarify, also on the axis of FIBA is absurd. The Economist came out this very, infamous image of them all standing, like they had a headshot of them all looking moderate. So the axis of the from a couple of years ago is like, as they're all completely different. The Chinese are a state. Well, right now there's kind of a status quo power. They benefit from the system as it is. The West would classify Russia and North Korea and Iran as pariah states, right? China's very much in the system. The other three are not. I don't think you're going to see America designating China as state sponsor of terrorism anytime soon, just because. So yeah, I find the parallels absurd. But more specifically about this point about the system, like when we look at autocratic nations like the Russians, the Chinese, and what's happening with Iran at this attempt of regime change, like looking back at the Cold War, what do we take from that?
I mean, look, you had in the Cold War, you had attempts at regime change, and some of them were successful. Of course, the Americans were very famous for their multiple attempts at regime change, Iran being one. We already discussed 1953, but you also had Guatemala 1954. You had the attempted regime change in Cuba, the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 that failed. That was another attempt. But then, you had any number of American invasions, especially like in Western Hemisphere, of different, toppling of various dictators and people whom the Americans felt were not, were not serving their interests, etc. So that was very much a Cold War thing, although it also predated the Cold War, the extension of American power. Now, other powers did that. The Soviet Union did that as well. They also would go in and topple people, whether it's Hafizullah Amin in Afghanistan, or, like they did in Hungary in 1956. You had the Soviet invasion of Hungary, you had the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. So you had that practiced by great power. So you could say that what we're seeing today is in some ways an outgrowth of the Cold War and the continuation of some of the same practices that also underpin the Cold War. In other words, this military operations to topple somebody in a foreign country, that's not something hugely unusual in the context of the Cold War. It is unusual, I guess, in our present situation, because after the end of the Cold War, it's only really just been the United States that has practiced it with any success. You look at the Russians are probably getting all envious about Maduro and Ali Khamenei, because that actually shows that America can do this kind of things, where the Russians have not been able to do it, right? We know that they plan to kill Zelensky, President Zelensky, in the early 2009.
It wasn't exactly
yeah, I mean, they stopped there, right? They stopped. It's not, but I don't know if the idea in 2008 was to get rid of Saakashvili, or, how wide they decided to stop, right? They could have done it. But they decided not to do it. But then in Ukraine, the key element of the invasion was to kill Zelensky. We know that now, but they fail, right? So they fail in that particular instance. So it seems that the idea of overthrowing a leader of a sovereign country, it sounds like it's just something out of the blue and something completely unheard of. In fact, this was something that was practiced widely during the Cold War. And even after the Cold War, there were instances of this, right? The United States kind of leading the way here, and the Russians being much less successful. You know who has not done that? The Chinese. I'm just trying to think if the Chinese have actually tried to overthrow anyone. We always think of the Chinese as being this very, aggressive power threatening American interests and Western interests. And maybe this is so in terms of, in economic terms. But the last time the Chinese tried to invade anybody was in Vietnam in 1979. And that was a disaster. So they fought for a couple of weeks and they said, okay, bye, we're getting out of here. This also
came and said hi. But no, the Chinese haven't fought a proper conflict. I mean, they've had the border skirmishes with the Indians.
1602, so yeah, like a big war. This was a big war, and then they had little skirmishes, which have been recent with that.
And the Manchuria thing with the Soviets as well is quite an interesting one when we talk about the future of the Russian-Chinese relationship.
Sure. Yeah, 69.
But I guess, my last question really is sort of simply, are we in Cold War or not?
That's a really deep and difficult question. Historians are generally skeptical of this kind of characterizations because they say, well, what's the point? The Cold War was different. It's something else now. Why do we want to call this a Cold War? And I'll tell you why this is important. Because you call it the Cold War or anything else because you are trying to say that the policies that worked the last time around should also work today. So the Cold War and designating something as a Cold War kind of brings in policy solutions. In other words, during the Cold War, the policy was containment. So you contain the Soviet power, and that's the way to win the long game. Now you would say, well, yeah, if this is a Cold War, well, this is it? Well, that's a question. So there's some it's a lot of historians can say this is not a Cold War. Why? They'll say, well, the Cold War was a struggle between communism and capitalism and different ideas about how to manage life and modernity, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't have this ideological element today. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. You don't have struggle with communism quite in the same way. I mean, you go to China today, you try to find any aspect of it that is communist. I don't know, surveillance, everybody has surveillance these days. But so that ideological element may or may not be there. You might say that the competition is not as intense between systems. Like Chinese are not trying to export their system anywhere. To my knowledge, right? You might argue they are, but I think they are not. I'm not certain that the way the Soviets did. But in other ways, the competition today between great powers is just as intense as it was during the Cold War, including with the use of proxies, including with proxy wars, whether we look at Ukraine as a proxy war, Iran, potentially, probably not a very good designation. Also, that this competition spreads across the whole spectrum from economics to politics to technology to culture to anything, right? So it's not encompassing great power competition. But the key aspect that makes it similar is the presence of nuclear weapons. So that's hence the need for proxy wars. We have superpowers that are afraid to go to direct military confrontation with one another, as we have had the case between the Soviet Union and the United States, and more recently between Russia and the United States. Then you have to have proxy wars, right? So nuclear revolution has sort of revolutionized excuse my tautology here, but revolutionized the way we approach conflict in general. And so even today, it is impossible to envision a direct, it's not impossible, but it will be crazy for the United States and China to have a direct war among themselves, right? Because that could easily end up as a nuclear Armageddon. So given all that, you're then stuck with this question of, well, if they cannot go directly to war against one another, then how are they going to manage their increasingly confrontational relationship? And this is where parallels to the Cold War come to mind. And you don't have to call it a Cold War or Cold War 2.0 or whatever. You can just say, well, there's some continuity, and some of these continuities suggest the kind of policies that would be required within policy of containment, for example, or the policy of decoupling, for example. So parallels, continuities, also discontinuities, whether it's in terms of ideology, slightly different situation today, or whether it's in terms of the interconnectedness of the economies, right, of China and the United States, also much more of an issue today than it was during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Threat on Russia and Russia's nuclear power, and NATO was never going to invade Russia, so what's the point? But we need to put that aside and try to put ourselves in the shoes of this guy in the Kremlin and try to see the world with his eyes. And it's entirely conceivable that he saw the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO as a real thing, or that he saw the possibility of Ukraine somehow being integrated into the Western military alliance, whether it's NATO or just NATO getting access to Ukraine as a real thing.